He threw her suitcase onto the street. Years later at the airport, the Millionaire CEO froze when two little girls with his eyes ran past him. Andrew Collins had built his entire life on control, on the unshakable belief that nothing and no one could disturb the empire he had so carefully constructed. He was the kind of man whose voice silenced a room, whose signature on a contract shifted markets, whose name was enough to command both fear and admiration. Yet power had hardened him, had stripped away the vulnerability that once existed in the young man he had been, leaving behind someone who had no tolerance for weakness, no patience for anything that threatened the perfect image he projected to the world. That was the man Emma had fallen in love with, though in those early days she had seen a gentleness beneath the arrogance, a flicker of warmth that convinced her he was capable of love. But that night, when everything came crashing down, Andrew revealed a side of himself she had never wanted to believe was real. It had started with an argument, though Emma could no longer remember the words that first ignited the fire. What she remembered instead was the way Andrew's face hardened, his jaw tight, his blue eyes flashing with a coldness she had never seen directed at her before. He had always been passionate, often forceful in his opinions, but this was different. This was a man consumed by pride, by fear, by the desperate need to maintain control at any cost. She had tried to reason with him, her own voice breaking as she begged him to listen, to see her not as a threat but as the woman who loved him. Yet he would not hear it. In his mind, her presence had become dangerous, her love a liability, her very existence a crack in the walls of power he had built so carefully around himself. When he grabbed her suitcase, pulling it from the closet with a force that nearly sent her stumbling, Emma realized that this was no longer an argument but a rupture that could not be repaired. She watched in disbelief as he carried it through the penthouse, past the glass walls that looked out over the glittering city skyline, and with a violent gesture hurled it into the street below. The sound of it crashing against the pavement echoed like a final verdict. She stood frozen, her heart pounding, her vision blurred with tears, as he turned to her with words that cut deeper than any knife. "Leave," he shouted, his voice sharp and merciless, "and never come back." Then, with a slam that shook the walls, he closed the door. For a long moment, Emma stood in silence, the echo of his voice ringing in her ears. She could not move, could not breathe, could not believe that the man she had trusted with her heart had become a stranger before her very eyes. The city lights outside seemed to mock her, glittering with promise while her world collapsed in darkness. When she finally forced herself to move, she walked slowly to the street, her legs trembling beneath her, her hands clutching the railing as if to steady herself against the storm that raged inside her. Her suitcase lay battered on the pavement, its contents spilling onto the ground, the fragments of her life scattered like the pieces of her heart. She knelt to gather them, her tears falling silently onto the clothes she had once packed with hope for a shared future. But even as despair threatened to consume her, another feeling stirred deep within her, a quiet, unyielding strength she had not known she possessed. She was no longer just Emma, the woman who had loved Andrew Collins. She was Emma, the woman who would protect the tiny life growing inside her, the woman who would fight to build a future not with him, but in spite of him. She pressed a trembling hand against her stomach, whispering words of comfort to the child who would never know the rejection of that night, only the fierce, unwavering love she would give. She lifted her chin, wiped her tears, and with the last of her strength, walked away from the man who had cast her out, not knowing that her absence would one day become the very thing that shattered him. That night, as Andrew poured himself another drink, convinced he had secured his future by severing ties with her, he had no idea of the mistake he had made. He believed he had rid himself of a problem, silenced a distraction, cleared a path for ambition. But what he had really done was abandon the one woman who could have saved him from the emptiness that already gnawed at his soul, and in doing so, he had condemned himself to years of regret. And Emma, walking alone through the city with her battered suitcase and her unborn children hidden beneath her heart, carried not only the weight of betrayal but also the fragile beginnings of a story that would one day return to confront him in the most unexpected way. Emma's departure from Andrew's world was not a dramatic escape into some new and shining future but a slow and painful descent into a life she had never planned for herself. The first nights after he had cast her out were the hardest. She had found a small, inexpensive room in a boarding house on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where walls were thin and neighbors were shadows passing in the corridor. The air smelled faintly of mildew, the furniture was mismatched and worn, but it was a roof over her head and a place to breathe without the weight of his disdain pressing down on her. She lay awake on a lumpy mattress, her hand resting protectively over her stomach, whispering promises she was not sure she knew how to keep. She told the child growing inside her that they were not alone, that she would find a way to give them safety and love, even if the rest of the world had turned its back. Each day became a battle of survival. Emma had never been wealthy, but her years with Andrew had pulled her into a world where money was an afterthought, where food was delivered, clothes were tailored, and security came in the form of bodyguards and luxury apartments. Now she returned to the raw truth of life, counting every dollar, choosing between a bus fare and a loaf of bread, learning to do without in ways that both frightened and strengthened her. She worked at a diner, first taking late shifts that left her exhausted, her body aching as her pregnancy advanced, then switching to mornings so that she would have evenings free to rest. She endured the stares, the whispered gossip about the unmarried young woman carrying a child alone, and she answered them all with silence. Pride had no place in her life anymore, survival was all that mattered. When her daughters were born, two tiny, perfect girls with shockingly dark hair and the same piercing blue eyes she had once loved in Andrew, Emma felt both her greatest heartbreak and her greatest joy. She named them Sophia and Isabella, names she had once imagined sharing with him in a conversation about their future, names that now belonged solely to her. Holding them in her arms, she realized that the loneliness and rejection she had suffered no longer mattered in the same way. She was no longer fighting only for herself but for them, for the little girls who would never know the cruelty of the man who had given them life but had denied them love. In their cries she heard her purpose, and in their tiny hands clutching her fingers she found the strength to endure sleepless nights, endless work, and the gnawing ache of what she had lost. Life as a single mother was relentless, yet it was not without its moments of beauty. Emma discovered joy in small things, the way Sophia giggled when bubbles floated through the air, the way Isabella fell asleep with her tiny fist curled against Emma's chest. She learned to stretch a meal into 2 days, to sew tiny dresses from second-hand fabric, to find laughter in the middle of exhaustion. Neighbors who had once gossiped began to admire her resilience, offering hand-me-downs or watching the girls for an hour so she could work an extra shift. Emma accepted their help not with shame but with gratitude, understanding now that pride was a luxury she could not afford. Still, there were nights when the weight of it all threatened to crush her. On those nights, when the girls finally slept and the silence of her small apartment wrapped around her, she allowed herself to remember him. She would see Andrew's face in their eyes, in the shape of their smiles, and she would feel the sting of betrayal all over again. She wondered if he ever thought of her, if he had even once regretted the words he had thrown at her like daggers. Then she would force herself to push the thoughts away, reminding herself that she could not dwell on a man who had chosen power over love, pride over family. She had chosen differently, and her choice gave her a kind of strength Andrew would never understand. As the years passed, Emma transformed. She was no longer the young woman who had been cast out with a suitcase and broken heart. She became a mother who carried 2 children through every storm, who worked until her hands ached, who sacrificed sleep and comfort to ensure her daughters never felt abandoned. Sophia and Isabella grew into lively, curious girls who filled her life with noise and laughter, their bond inseparable, their energy exhausting yet life-giving. Emma's love was the glue that held their small world together, and even though she often felt she was failing, her daughters saw only strength. What Emma did not know was that across the city, Andrew was beginning to feel the cracks in his carefully built world. The loneliness he had chosen was becoming unbearable, the emptiness louder with each passing night. He told himself he had done the right thing, but when he looked in the mirror, he no longer recognized the man staring back. He had power, he had wealth, but what he lacked was the very thing Emma had found in the midst of her struggle: love that gave meaning to every sacrifice. Neither of them knew it yet, but their paths were already bending back toward one another, guided by the quiet pull of fate and the undeniable truth that what had been torn apart was never truly gone. As the years passed, Sophia and Isabella became the center of Emma's universe, their laughter echoing through the small apartment that had once felt empty and cold but now pulsed with life and warmth. From the moment they could walk, they were inseparable, often holding hands as if afraid the world might pull them apart. At 2 years old, their personalities began to emerge in ways that startled Emma with their individuality. Sophia was bold and curious, always reaching for the unknown, while Isabella was more cautious, carefully observing before taking a step. Yet in both of them, Emma saw the same eyes, blue and piercing, the mirror of a man she had once loved and now tried every day to forget. It was both a torment and a gift. She learned quickly that raising twins demanded more than she ever thought she possessed. Her morning started before the sun, preparing breakfast while the girls chattered in their crib, giggling at each other's nonsense words. She dressed them in clothes she had mended late at night, often cutting and stitching fabric by hand to make something new from the second-hand items donated by kind neighbors. Then she bundled them into their stroller, walking briskly to the daycare before heading to her shift at the hotel where she worked long hours cleaning rooms and changing linens. Every day was the same routine, a grind that left her body weary, but every evening when she returned to find her daughters running toward her with squeals of delight, it was as though the weight melted away. There were nights, however, when the exhaustion pushed her to the edge. The girls would fight sleep, taking turns crying until Emma, near tears herself, would rock them both in her arms, humming lullabies she had once sung as a child. She whispered promises to them even then, vows that they would never feel unwanted, never doubt that they were loved. It was a promise she made as much to herself as to them, a shield against the bitterness that still lingered from Andrew's rejection. When loneliness crept into her heart, she would watch Sophia and Isabella sleeping, their identical faces soft and angelic, and remind herself that out of her deepest pain had come her greatest blessing. As Sophia and Isabella grew older, Emma noticed how much of Andrew lived in them. It was not just their eyes, though those were impossible to ignore. It was the way Sophia tilted her head with the same stubborn defiance he had once shown in business meetings, the way Isabella's smile carried a spark of charm that could soften even the hardest gaze. Each time she saw those traits, Emma's chest tightened, torn between anger and longing. She wanted to erase Andrew from her memory, but how could she when his presence was written so clearly on their faces? At times she wondered if fate was mocking her, forcing her to live daily with the reflection of the man who had cast her aside. But then the girls would collapse into her lap, wrapping their small arms around her neck, and she would understand that they were not him, they were hers, hers to love, to guide, to protect. Emma began to notice the questions forming in their eyes long before they found the courage to ask them. They watched other children at the park with their fathers, saw classmates brought to school by both parents, and though they said nothing at first, Emma could feel the silence pressing between them. One evening, as she was reading them a bedtime story, Isabella finally spoke. "Mama, why don't we have a daddy?" The question struck Emma like a blow. She had prepared herself for it, but no amount of preparation could erase the ache it brought. She swallowed hard, brushing a lock of hair from Isabella's forehead, and answered as gently as she could. "Some daddies are not ready to be daddies. But that doesn't mean you are not loved." Sophia, sitting beside her, looked up with those piercing eyes and asked, "But will we ever meet him?" Emma's heart clenched, and she pulled them both into her arms, whispering, "I don't know, my loves. But you will always have me." That night, when the girls had finally drifted to sleep, Emma sat alone by the window, staring out at the city lights. She hated Andrew for what he had done, for the way he had chosen his pride over them, but she also hated herself for the sliver of hope she still carried deep inside. A part of her, however small, still wondered if he ever thought of her, if he ever imagined the children who bore his face. She shook her head, forcing herself to let the thought go. He had made his choice, and she had made hers. She would not allow him to poison the life she had built, no matter how much his absence lingered in the shadows. But Emma could not see the future waiting for her, a future in which Andrew's carefully guarded world would finally collide with hers again. She did not know that while she struggled to keep food on the table and dreams alive for her daughters, Andrew was beginning to feel the cracks in his own carefully constructed life. He did not yet know their names, had not seen their faces, but soon, fate would place them before him in a way neither of them could have prepared for, and the world they had both fought to build apart would begin to unravel. Andrew Collins had everything the world told him he should want, and yet the older he became, the more suffocating that everything felt. His name graced magazine covers, his face appeared at charity galas, his fortune grew with every passing year, but when the lights dimmed and the applause faded, he was left in silence, surrounded by glass walls and the empty echo of his own footsteps. In boardrooms, he was untouchable, decisive, even ruthless, but in the privacy of his penthouse, where the city skyline stretched endlessly below, he could not ignore the gnawing hollowness that no business deal could fill. He told himself it was stress, the natural burden of leadership, but deep down he knew it was something else, something he refused to name because naming it meant facing the truth of what he had lost. On some nights, when the city was particularly quiet and the shadows stretched long across the floor, he would catch himself remembering Emma. Not in the way one remembers a passing stranger, but in flashes so vivid it felt as though she were standing in the room. He would remember her laughter, low and unguarded, the way it softened the hard edges of his world. He would remember the warmth in her brown eyes, the softness of her hair against his fingers, the way she believed in him in a way no one else ever had. And then, inevitably, he would remember the night he had thrown her out, the sound of her suitcase hitting the pavement, the look on her face when he had slammed the door. That memory haunted him, not because he doubted the decision he had made then, but because it left him wondering what it had cost him beyond what he had been willing to admit. He had never allowed himself to imagine children. In his mind, they were distractions, vulnerabilities, anchors that slowed men of ambition. Yet, as time went on, he began to feel the absence of something unnamed, a sharp ache that came when he saw fathers with their children at airports or when business associates spoke casually of their families. He pushed the thoughts away, burying himself in work, but the emptiness only grew. Women came and went, drawn to his wealth and reputation, but none stayed long, and he did not mourn their absence. What unsettled him was not their leaving but the fact that none of them ever touched the emptiness Emma had left behind. In public, Andrew remained the image of success, his dark hair perfectly styled, his blue eyes cold and commanding, his tailored suits and armor against the world. But in private, the mask began to crack. He poured himself drinks he barely touched, sat in silence for hours staring at the city below, and sometimes, against his will, whispered her name into the darkness. He told himself it was weakness, a flaw he needed to eradicate, but no matter how many deals he closed, no matter how many accolades he collected, Emma lingered in the corners of his mind like a ghost. There were nights when he considered reaching out, not to beg for forgiveness, his pride would never allow such a thing, but to prove to himself that she was still out there, that she had not disappeared into nothingness. Yet he never did. He told himself she had moved on, that she had probably built a life without him, and perhaps that was for the best. What good would it do to reopen old wounds? Still, Sometimes when he passed through an airport or stepped out of a limousine at a hotel, he caught himself scanning the crowd, searching for a face he had no right to see again. He had no idea that Emma's life had unfolded parallel to his, that she had not only survived but created a world he could never have imagined. He did not know that the emptiness he felt was not merely the absence of her, but the absence of two little girls who bore his blood, children whose existence he had denied without ever seeing their faces. Fate was patient, biding its time, and though Andrew tried to control every aspect of his life, there was one thing he could not anticipate: the moment when the life he had rejected would walk straight into his path and leave him powerless. That reckoning was closer than he realized, closer than the breath between his thoughts. And when it came, it would not arrive as a whisper but as a shock, a jolt that would unravel everything he thought he knew about himself, about success, and about the choices that had defined him. The day that would change everything for Andrew arrived without warning, as ordinary and unremarkable as any other. He was at the airport, moving briskly through the terminal with his entourage, his schedule packed as usual, his mind already on the meeting awaiting him in another city. Airports were familiar territory for him, places where people either hurried past without daring to meet his gaze or paused to stare at the commanding figure they recognized from business magazines. To him, these spaces had always been transitory, places of arrival and departure, never of revelation. But that day, as he adjusted his cufflinks and listened half-heartedly to his assistant run through his agenda, his gaze drifted across the waiting hall and froze on a scene so ordinary and yet so devastating that it nearly brought him to his knees. There, standing by the large glass windows overlooking the runway, was a woman he had not seen in years. Emma. The sight of her was like a blow to the chest, stealing the air from his lungs. She was no longer the girl he had thrown out in a storm of anger and pride. She was older, stronger, her blonde hair catching the light as though it carried its own quiet radiance. Her posture was firm, her chin held high, but he could see the traces of struggle in the faint lines around her eyes, the quiet resilience that only hardship could carve into a person. For a moment, Andrew thought he must be imagining her, a vision conjured by guilt and memory, until the sound of laughter shattered his disbelief. Two little girls darted around her legs, their small hands clutching tiny backpacks, their voices bright and eager as they pointed at the planes beyond the glass. They were identical, like two mirrors of each other, and yet it was not their resemblance to one another that rooted Andrew to the spot, it was their resemblance to him. The dark hair, the piercing blue eyes that shone with mischief and wonder, the very shape of their faces, all of it struck him with the undeniable truth. These were his daughters. Children he had never known, never touched, never named. The ultrasound he had refused to see years ago now stood before him in the form of two living, breathing girls, and the weight of it was almost unbearable. His steps faltered, and for the first time in his life, Andrew Collins could not move forward. His entourage continued without him, their voices fading as he stood rooted in place, his heart pounding so hard it echoed in his ears. Emma looked up then, as though sensing his presence, and their eyes met across the crowded terminal. In that moment, time ceased to exist. He saw the flash of recognition in her gaze, followed by the tightening of her jaw, the protective way she reached for the hands of the girls who instantly leaned into her sides. There was no greeting, no hesitation on her part, only a wall of defiance that told him everything he needed to know: she did not want him there. But Andrew could not look away. He saw his life reflected in those children, the life he had thrown away with one cruel decision. The cold words he had once spoken, "Leave, and never come back," echoed in his mind, mocking him now as he faced the reality of what those words had cost. He had thought he was protecting himself, his empire, his reputation. Instead, he had robbed himself of the only thing that could have given his life meaning. He wanted to speak, to call her name, to reach for the daughters who stared at him with wide, curious eyes, but his voice refused to come. His throat tightened, and for the first time since his youth, Andrew Collins was afraid. Emma did not give him the chance to recover. With calm but deliberate steps, she guided the girls away from the window, her hand resting firmly on their shoulders, her eyes never leaving his until the very last moment. There was no mistaking the message in her gaze: "You do not belong in this world we have built." As she turned, her hair catching the light once more, the twins glanced back at him, their blue eyes locking with his for a fleeting second, and in that instant Andrew felt as though his soul had been laid bare. Then they disappeared into the crowd, swallowed by the sea of travelers, leaving him standing alone, paralyzed by a truth he could no longer ignore. The airport, once a place of efficiency and movement, became a cage around him. He could not will himself to follow, not with his heart shattering under the weight of guilt and longing. For years, he had believed himself untouchable, above the consequences of emotion, but here he was, undone by the sight of two little girls whose existence proved he had been wrong all along. He stood in silence long after his flight had been called, long after his entourage had vanished toward the gate, until the bustling noise of the terminal faded into a hollow emptiness inside his chest. Andrew Collins had built his empire on decisions, on the ability to act swiftly and decisively, yet in the most important moment of his life, he had done nothing. He had stood still, a man who could command nations yet could not take a single step toward the family he had denied. And as he finally turned away, his reflection caught in the glass wall before him, he no longer saw the powerful CEO the world admired. He saw a broken man, haunted by the faces of two daughters who had looked at him with his own eyes. Andrew left the airport that day carrying a weight heavier than any business failure or scandal could ever bring. For the first time in years, the steady rhythm of his life faltered. He sat in the back of his limousine, the leather seats cold and unwelcoming, while the city blurred past the tinted windows, but his mind refused to return to contracts and meetings. Instead, it clung to the image of Emma holding the hands of the two little girls who looked so unmistakably like him. Their laughter still echoed in his ears, high-pitched and pure, a sound he had never heard before and yet one that felt as though it had always belonged to him. He replayed every detail of the moment, Emma's eyes flashing with both recognition and warning, the children's curious glances, the way their small shoulders had leaned instinctively toward their mother as if they understood she was their shield. For a man who had built his life on certainty, he was drowning in questions he did not know how to answer. That night, his penthouse felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. The floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city skyline glittering with life, but Andrew felt no connection to it anymore. The silence pressed in around him, and for once he did not turn on the television or call for company to drown it out. Instead, he poured himself a glass of scotch and sat in the dark, staring at his reflection in the window. He no longer saw the polished, confident man who graced magazine covers, he saw the hollowness behind his blue eyes and the undeniable truth etched into the memory of those little girls. They were his. He could not deny it, no matter how much pride told him to turn away. The question that consumed him was not whether they were his, but what he would do about it now that he knew. The following days were torture. He went through the motions at work, delivering speeches, signing contracts, shaking hands, but his mind was elsewhere. Colleagues noticed the distraction in his eyes, the hesitation in his usually razor-sharp responses, but no one dared ask why. Andrew had never allowed anyone to question him, yet now he found himself questioning everything. For the first time in his life, he wondered if success meant anything at all without someone to share it with. He thought of Emma, of the strength it must have taken for her to raise twins alone, of the sacrifices she must have made, of the nights she must have spent comforting them without help. Shame burned through him when he remembered the cruelty with which he had cast her out, convinced that he was protecting his empire when in reality he had only destroyed his own chance at happiness. One evening, unable to contain the turmoil any longer, Andrew instructed his driver to take him through the neighborhood where Emma had once lived. He did not know if she was still there, but some part of him hoped he might catch a glimpse of her, of them. The streets were unfamiliar to him now, a world away from the polished marble and glass he was accustomed to. Children played outside in worn sneakers, mothers carried groceries in tired arms, neighbors gathered on porches in the fading light. He felt like an intruder in this world, a man who had traded love for power, who now drove through the remnants of what could have been his life if he had chosen differently. He did not see Emma that night, but he felt her presence everywhere, in the faces of the families around him, in the warmth of the laughter that spilled from modest homes. It was a stark reminder of everything he had rejected, everything he could no longer claim as his own. Emma, meanwhile, tried to push the encounter at the airport from her mind. She had seen the shock on Andrew's face, the recognition, and though part of her had taken bitter satisfaction in his silence, another part trembled with fear. She had built her life around keeping her daughters safe from the shadow of their father, from the pain his rejection might cause them, and now that fragile wall had cracked. She knew Andrew well enough to understand that he would not let the moment go. He was a man who chased what unsettled him, who could not bear to lose control. And yet, when she tucked Sophia and Isabella into bed that night, she promised herself that no matter what he tried, she would not let him hurt them. They were her world, her reason for enduring every hardship, and she would protect them with everything she had. But Andrew was not the same man he had been 6 years ago, and the haunting image of his daughters refused to let him sleep. He began to search, quietly at first, using his resources to find out where Emma lived, what her life had become. When he learned of the struggles she had endured, the modest apartment she called home, the long hours she worked, something inside him shifted. The pride that had once kept him distant began to crumble, replaced by a gnawing need to make things right. He told himself it was about responsibility, about facing the consequences of his choices, but deep down he knew it was more than that. He wanted to know them, to hear their laughter without standing paralyzed in an airport, to become the father they had never known. For the first time in his life, Andrew Collins felt fear, not of losing power, not of financial ruin, but of facing the 2 little girls whose lives he had missed entirely. The empire he had built seemed meaningless compared to the chance to hold his daughters' hands, to hear them call him something more than a stranger. And as he sat awake in the dark hours of the night, he realized that no amount of money, no deal or title, could give him what he truly wanted now, the chance to step into the world he had once thrown away. Andrew knew that finding Emma would not be difficult for a man of his means, but what paralyzed him was not the logistics of locating her, it was the uncertainty of what would happen once he did. He had never in his life begged anyone for anything. Deals, contracts, alliances, everything he had ever wanted was won through power, persuasion, or intimidation. But as he pictured Emma standing with the twins, her posture protective and unyielding, he realized that none of the tools that had made him successful in business would help him win back what he had lost. For the first time, he was preparing to step into a battle where the only currency was humility, something he had buried years ago beneath pride and ambition. When he finally stood outside the modest building Emma called home, the difference between their worlds struck him like a blow. His polished shoes and tailored suit looked absurd on the cracked sidewalk, his luxury car out of place on a street lined with aging vehicles and small gardens carefully tended by people who had little but cherished what they had. He hesitated, staring at the entrance, rehearsing words in his head, but every phrase sounded hollow, every excuse inadequate. What apology could erase years of absence? What promise could make up for missed birthdays, sleepless nights, scraped knees, and bedtime stories he had never told? He had been absent for their entire lives. And yet, he knew he had to try, because not trying meant losing them forever. Emma opened the door herself, her expression hardening the moment she saw him. The years had changed her, deepening her beauty into something sharper, forged by struggle and resilience. Her eyes, once soft with love, now blazed with caution and something dangerously close to anger. She stepped outside, closing the door behind her as if to keep the children shielded from his presence, and for a moment Andrew felt as though he had been reduced to a stranger standing on her threshold. He spoke her name quietly, almost reverently, but Emma cut him off before he could say more. "You don't get to come here," she said, her voice low but firm. "You don't get to show up after all these years and think you can undo what you did." The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. He had no defense, no justification that could withstand the raw truth of her pain. So he did the only thing left to him: he admitted his weakness. He told her he had been wrong, that his pride and fear had blinded him, that he could not undo the past, but he wanted, desperately, to be part of their daughter's future. He did not dress his words in charm or power, he let them fall raw and broken, because that was all he had left. Emma listened, her arms crossed, her jaw tight, and for a long time she said nothing. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, and Andrew, a man who had faced down boardrooms and hostile takeovers, felt himself shrinking under the weight of one woman's silence. Finally, Emma spoke, and her words were like steel. "They don't know you exist. They don't know what you did to me. And I will not let you walk into their lives and break them the way you broke me." She turned as if to leave, but Andrew reached out, not to stop her, but to plead. His voice shook as he told her he was not asking for forgiveness, not yet, and not from her. He only wanted the chance to earn the right to stand in front of his daughters and prove he was not the man who had once cast them aside. He confessed that for the first time in his life, he had felt fear of living and dying without ever hearing his children call him father. Emma looked at him then, really looked at him, and for a fleeting moment he saw her resolve waver. But it was gone as quickly as it came. She told him he had a long way to go, that words were meaningless without proof, and that if he truly wanted to be part of their lives, he would have to start by showing them who he was through actions, not declarations. She would not allow him near them until she believed he was capable of love, not control. Then she turned and went back inside, leaving him standing alone on the doorstep, the sound of the door clicking shut louder than any rejection he had ever faced in his life. Yet for all the pain of that moment, Andrew felt something shift inside him. For the first time, he had not been able to buy or command what he wanted. For the first time, he had been forced to lay himself bare, and though Emma had not forgiven him, she had not completely closed the door either. She had given him a condition, a challenge, and for Andrew Collins, challenges were the very fuel of his existence. But this was not a business deal. This was not a negotiation. This was a battle for love, for trust, for redemption. And he knew, as he walked back to his car, that it would be the hardest fight of his life. Weeks turned into months, and Andrew's life shifted in ways he had never thought possible. For the first time, he began to live not for meetings, acquisitions, or power, but for the small, fragile chance to win the right to stand beside his daughters. He started quietly, taking Emma's words to heart, knowing that grand gestures and money meant nothing to her now. He donated anonymously to the school where the girls attended, not for recognition but because he wanted their classrooms to have new books and working computers. He began to step back from the endless demands of his company, delegating responsibilities he had once hoarded out of fear of losing control. For the first time in his adult life, he allowed himself to prioritize something beyond his empire. His greatest test came the day Emma finally agreed to let him see the girls from a distance. She invited him to the park, warning him not to approach them, not to say a word, only to observe. Andrew accepted without protest, though the thought of being so close without being able to reach for them nearly tore him apart. When he saw them running across the grass, their laughter carrying on the wind, his heart ached with a longing so fierce it nearly brought him to his knees. Sophia climbed the jungle gym with fearless determination, while Isabella carefully helped a smaller child climb the first rung, her gentle patience so achingly familiar that Andrew thought his chest might break. They were his, undeniably his, and yet at that moment they were also wholly Emma's, shaped by her love, her resilience, her strength. He watched them chase each other, hair flying, cheeks flushed with joy, and for the first time in years, tears slipped down his face unbidden. Slowly, Emma allowed more. A meeting at a cafe, where the girl sat across from him, studying him with wide, curious eyes while Emma remained close, her protective presence never wavering. At first, they barely spoke, shy and uncertain, but Andrew did not push. He answered their tentative questions, told them stories from his childhood, and listened more than he spoke. He found himself laughing in ways he had forgotten he could, a genuine, unguarded sound that surprised even Emma. With each visit, the walls between them began to crumble, not quickly, not all at once, but gradually, like ice thawing under the warmth of spring. The moment that truly shattered him came one evening when he was walking them back to Emma's car after an outing. Sophia slipped her hand into his without hesitation, her small fingers curling around his own as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Isabella followed a moment later, tugging at his sleeve and asking softly if he would come again tomorrow. The innocence of their trust, the quiet acceptance in their voices, undid him completely. For a man who had once believed himself incapable of love, he now knew he had found it in its purest form, and he vowed silently that he would never, ever let them down again. Emma watched him carefully during these months, wary but slowly softening as she saw the transformation in him. This was not the Andrew she had once known, the man who had thrown her out with nothing but pride in his eyes. This was a man stripped of arrogance, learning humility through the eyes of two children who had no agenda, who demanded only honesty and love. He did not try to dazzle them with gifts or impress them with wealth. He sat on the floor of their living room building towers from wooden blocks, he let them braid his hair clumsily with giggles of delight, he listened to their endless stories about school and friends. And Emma, though she told herself to remain guarded, found her heart betraying her more with each passing day. One evening, as the girls slept and the house was quiet, Emma and Andrew sat together at the kitchen table. There was no shouting now, no bitterness, only the weight of all that had passed between them. Andrew spoke softly, telling her that he knew he could never erase the past, that he did not expect forgiveness overnight, but that he would spend the rest of his life proving that he was not the man who had once chosen pride over love. Emma listened, her hands folded, her eyes reflecting both pain and possibility. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps people could change, that perhaps even the deepest wounds could heal if nurtured with care. The story that had begun with rejection and pain did not end in a single moment of reconciliation, but in the quiet, gradual weaving together of broken threads. Andrew became a father not through grand declarations but through daily acts of love, through patience and humility. Emma, in turn, allowed herself to open the door to the possibility of a new beginning, not forgetting the past but choosing to build a future where the mistakes no longer defined them. The twins, with their laughter and light, became the bridge between two broken hearts, the living proof that love, once lost, could be found again in the most unexpected ways. And so, though the road had been long and fraught with pain, it led at last to something neither of them had dared to dream, a family, imperfect and scarred, but whole at last.